The first cruelty of the morning was meant to be quiet, spoken low behind a gloved hand at the coaching inn's yard, but Ivy Marchcroft heard every word. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give the two women by the mounting block the satisfaction of a face pinched by shame. The inn stood at the crossroads outside Havershall in the autumn of 1812, its old sign creaking in a wind that seemed to lean against the shutters as if listening in on the travelers below. Rain had swept the yard clean an hour before and left the cobbles slick and mirror bright, so that the reflections of gentlemen's boots and ladies' hems trembled beneath them like a second, doubled world that had not yet decided which of its people were worth showing. A pale sun was trying and failing to warm the stones. The word the women had used, the small pretty word they had placed against her back like a pin, was useful. Useful, the narrator of any decent society would have called it a compliment. Ivy had learned, over the 23 years she had been alive and the 7 she had been in her cousin's house, that useful was only the respectable coat contempt had chosen to wear that season, and she recognized the cut of it the moment it brushed her shoulders. She was in a gray traveling cloak that had been her mother's, mended twice at the shoulder seam and once along the hem, its wool still soft from long use, though the nap was worn to a low, quiet sheen. Pinned at her throat was a small oval brooch of dulled silver, no larger than a walnut, its edge chased with a plain running vine, and its face bearing only a single pressed flower behind glass, a violet whose color had faded to the ash purple of an evening cloud. It had been her mother's, and her mother's mother's before that, and had come to Ivy in a wooden box that smelled of beeswax and lavender on the last afternoon of her mother's life. Beside the emerald sprays and gold combs of the Marchcroft cousins, the brooch was a modest, unfashionable thing, and this had always been the point. She kept a hand near the collar of the cloak as if to steady the brooch against the wind, though the wind was not, in fact, blowing at her throat. It was a small thing. It comforted her. The Marchcroft carriage, hired for the season and painted a fresh, ambitious blue, waited at the far end of the yard with its team stamping, and around it revolved the small planetary system of the family it served. Aunt Marchcroft, wide as a mantelpiece and softly powdered, was directing the strapping down of a hatbox as though she were addressing Parliament. Her daughter Delphine, 20 and radiant in a pelisse the exact shade of a hothouse peach, had arranged herself on the mounting block in a pose she had once seen in a print. Her younger sister Cassandra, 17 and rehearsing the size of a woman thrice betrayed, held a novel she had not opened. Between them and around them moved trunks and bandboxes, and a maid whose name none of them ever quite remembered, and threaded through it all was the low, sweet chatter of a family who took travel as their birthright and inconvenience as an insult designed against them personally. Ivy carried in one hand a small brown valise that held 2 gowns, a book of household accounts, a folded letter of introduction, and a set of watercolor cards she had painted herself during the long summer evenings when her cousins had wanted the parlor to themselves. In the other hand, she carried a paper-wrapped parcel of sandwiches made by the innkeeper's wife at Aunt Marchcroft's cheerful instruction that Ivy would prefer to eat on the road so as to save the family the tedium of a public meal. The words had sounded affectionate, the pressure beneath them was not. Delphine turned upon the mounting block with a small, pretty motion, as though her body had been designed to catch the attention of exactly the size of yard she stood in, and her eyes traveled the length of Ivy's cloak with the calm interest one might give a small creature crossing a polished surface. "It is a wonder," she said, "that gray wears so well upon a person who never asks anything of it." Aunt Marchcroft laughed the short, indulgent laugh she always laughed at Delphine's cleverness, and Cassandra folded her novel to her chest with a serious face, as though bearing witness. The laughter was not universal. It was enough. Ivy inclined her head as one inclines it at a passing acquaintance in church. "Gray is easy on the eye," she said, "and does not compete with what is worn beside it." It was not a retort. It sounded like humility. The women decoded it and did not, quite, know where to place their faces for a breath. Then Aunt Marchcroft rallied and said, "Oh, Ivy, you have always been so tactful." And Delphine smiled the smile of a person who has been told a joke she does not, this moment, entirely follow, and the little tableau resumed. Somewhere above the inn a rook complained. A door opened. The innkeeper's daughter passed through the yard with a bucket that steamed faintly and did not look up. No one saw the sketch fall. It was Ivy's second miscarriage of the morning, and no one saw it because it happened at the moment when everyone was looking at Delphine, which was the arrangement Delphine preferred everywhere. A folded square of paper slipped from between the pages of Ivy's small book of accounts as she shifted the valise, drifted to the wet cobbles, and lay there face down between a broom and a puddle. It contained a plan for a lending library, hand-drawn to scale, with the shelves numbered and the reading room's window annotated in a neat hand for the direction of the winter light. Ivy stooped, retrieved it, tucked it inside her sleeve, and straightened before anyone noticed the missing beat in the family choreography. That, too, was familiar. Her uncle Marchcroft, a florid gentleman who considered himself a patron of the arts because he owned a mediocre landscape and could name the man who had painted it, came down the inn steps buttoning his coat and announcing that the horses would not stand forever. Delphine kissed the air near her father's cheek. Cassandra sighed at a middle distance. Aunt Marchcroft counted trunks aloud, arriving each time at a different total. In the middle of the counting, a fresh sound entered the yard, and every head in it changed its angle without meaning to. A second carriage had drawn up on the road, larger and darker than any hire carriage. Its team matched black with white socks, its lamps polished to a low, bright temper, even under a pale sun. There was no crest painted upon the door, only a plain black lozenge where a crest could have gone, and this absence, more than any arms, told the yard that whoever had come to change horses did not require introduction. Talk thinned. Postures straightened. A groom who had been leaning against the pump straightened without looking to see why. Aunt Marchcroft, who could scent rank at half a mile even with a head cold, set her hatbox down as gently as if it had been a sleeping infant, and turned. The door of the second carriage opened. A lady stepped down first, small-boned and quick in a traveling dress of a deep, expensive plum, her dark hair caught up under a bonnet trimmed with a single ribbon of black. Her eyes moved across the yard in one clean sweep, as if she were reading a page, and stopped for a fraction of a second on Ivy's brooch before moving on. Behind her, and taking his time, a gentleman descended. He was tall and dressed in a plain dark coat with no ornament at all, and the yard, without being told, made room. He did not look about. He did not need to. His eyes passed the family carriage without registering it, took in the inn's sign, considered the horses at the trough, and returned to the small-boned lady with a private, tired patience. Aunt Marchcroft made a small involuntary sound. Delphine's color deepened by exactly the shade required for a print. Cassandra, who had never before understood what a heroine felt at the entrance of a hero, understood now and closed her novel entirely. Ivy, who was standing behind them and to the left, in the exact position which the family found convenient for their own visibility, kept her eyes upon the brown valise she carried and thought, quietly and without heat, that some rooms did not need a threshold to become theaters. The plum lady, whose name none of the Marchcrofts yet had the right to know, but which the inn's ostler murmured at once to a stable boy who murmured it back with awe, was Lady Sabine Ashenvale, sister to the Duke of Ashenvale, and the tall, dark gentleman was the Duke himself, Adrian Ashenvale, who had not been seen in Haversham for 11 years and had not been expected there today. The Duke, having ascertained that his horses would be exchanged with dispatch, offered his sister his arm and walked her toward the inn, as one walks toward a cold room one intends to leave quickly, and the Marchcrofts, in a single soft coordinated motion, arranged themselves so as to be seen. It was masterful. It was also useless, for the Duke passed them without seeing them, in the way that a man crossing a river does not see the reeds. Only Lady Sabine, whose eyes had done that first quick reading of the yard, allowed her gaze to touch each face briefly as she went, polite as a nod, indifferent as a shopping list, and once again, at the last of the faces, her look paused. Ivy did not know why. She met the look because it would have been discourteous to look away, and because she had learned that lowering her eyes was a language her cousins used to mean apology, and she had nothing to apologize for. Lady Sabine's mouth moved, not quite a smile, and she and her brother went into the inn. The yard exhaled. Aunt Marchcroft, recovering rapidly, remarked to no one in particular that of course one had heard the Duke was traveling north, though one had not thought he would stop at so common a place, and Delphine agreed with a pretty shrug that the common places were sometimes the most amusing. Ivy, unnoticed, retrieved from her sleeve the folded sketch of the lending library and slid it deeper into the pages of her account book, where the paper would be safe from rain. She was going, this journey, to Ashenvale under Wynne, a market town at the edge of the Duke's own country, to which she had been invited by a distant connection of her mother's, a Mrs. Dorrington, to consult upon the establishment of a small subscription library, and to teach 3 afternoons a week at a girls' school Mrs. Dorrington's late husband had founded, and Mrs. Dorrington's failing health could no longer superintend. It was, in the estimation of the Marchcrofts, a charitable use of a niece who had no dowry and no prospects, and had grown, alarmingly, into a young woman with opinions. It was, in Ivy's own estimation, a door. She had not spoken of the plans she carried in the account book, not to Aunt Marchcroft, who would have laughed, nor to Delphine, who would have borrowed the idea and painted it in her own colors, nor to Uncle Marchcroft, who would have called it clever and then forgotten it before breakfast the next day. She had spoken of them only in a letter to Mrs. Dorrington, and Mrs. Dorrington had written back on paper that smelled of dried rose leaves in a hand that shook a little, that she should come at once, and that the first winter at Ashenvale under Wynne would find them building shelves. Aunt Marchcroft called Ivy to her then, with a soft, irritated little jerk of the wrist. "My dear," she said, "do go and ask the innkeeper's boy to hurry with the second team. We cannot stand about waiting on Mr. Marchcroft's stomach, and Uncle Marchcroft looked wounded, and Delphine looked pleased, and Ivy, who had been going to ask exactly this in any case, inclined her head and crossed the yard. She did not go through the inn, because she saw through the low window that the Duke and his sister were sitting at the private parlor table, and it would not have done to walk between them and the fire. She went instead along the covered passage that ran behind the stables, where the smell of hay and wet leather was the honest, kind smell of any yard in the country. It was in this passage, out of sight of the Marchcrofts, and out of hearing of the yard, that she stopped for a breath. The wall was cool against her shoulder. Above her a shutter hung open, and beyond it, in the inn's back parlor where the servants ate, a woman she could not see was speaking in the low, complacent tone that carries further than a shout. She has no fortune, no father living, and only the aunt, and the aunt has told our mistress plainly she will make no effort for her," said the voice, which sounded like a lady's maid who had been at her mistress's ear as long as her mistress had had ears. "And the mistress?" said another voice, younger, avid. "The mistress has said," said the first voice, warming to the audience, "that Miss Ivy is useful, and that a useful person is a comfort in a household, and one need not marry off a comfort." "Well," said the second voice, "that's one way of keeping a girl in her place." The first voice laughed, and beyond the shutter the sound of a spoon against a bowl went on. Indifferent, Ivy did not move. She did not, this time, turn her face away or hurry on. She listened until the voices moved on to a discussion of the Duke's horses, and then she stepped away from the wall and continued down the passage as though she had been on her way there all along. She had not cried in the yard. She did not cry in the passage. Her mother, in the last autumn of her life, had sat by the window with the violet brooch in her hand, and had told Ivy, as one tells a child a small and portable truth, that a woman with a voice does not need a loud one, and that a woman with a place does not need to be given it by others. It had been an 8-word gift and a 15-word gift wrapped in the same breath, and Ivy had made of it, in the years since, a private aphorism she carried the way other women carried keys. A woman with a voice does not need a loud one. She said it, this morning, inside her head as she walked, and the sentence steadied her the way a hand on a railing steadies a person on a stair. The innkeeper's boy was at the stable, and she gave him her aunt's message in a voice that was neither loud nor apologetic, and he touched his cap and ran. On her way back she passed a servant's door standing half open into the private parlor, and heard through it not the Duke's voice, but his sister's, saying with the light, dry, precise diction of a woman who was speaking to be understood by exactly one person, that if he insisted upon changing horses again in this weather, he was a fool, and that Mamma had asked her to say so in Mamma's exact words. There was a pause in which Ivy imagined, for reasons she could not have named, a small, tired smile. Then the Duke's voice, low, even, and, she thought, faintly amused, said, "If Mamma asked you to say so, then say so once, not 3 times." And Lady Sabine said, "Oh, very well, once will do." And Ivy went on past the door and did not stop, and did not linger, because she had been raised to a strict rule about doors that were not hers and voices that were not for her. She did not know then that Lady Sabine's eyes, in the parlor, had gone at that same moment to the parlor's small window and had watched the gray cloak pass along the passage, and had said, not to her brother, but to herself, in the private hall of her own head, where she kept a great many observations in strict order, that girl, again. In the yard the second team was being brought out, and the Marchcroft carriage was almost ready. Ivy delivered the message, was thanked with a wave, and stepped aside to allow her uncle to shepherd his daughters into the carriage. It happened, then, that a great many things happened at once, as they will at coaching inns and at pivots in a life. Aunt Marchcroft, who had decided, upon glimpsing the Duke through the window, that the family must not be seen scrambling for their carriage like villagers late for a wedding, ordered Delphine to sit at the window on the right so as to be visible from the inn, and Delphine, obedient to a fault when it concerned her own visibility, seated herself with a fluffing of the peach pelisse. Cassandra was directed to the corner, on the grounds that her sighs were audible only at close range. Aunt Marchcroft herself claimed the seat opposite Delphine so as to be able to prompt her. Uncle Marchcroft, who had at last been permitted his pie, was still eating it in the private parlor. Ivy, who by long habit sat with her back to the horses, was told by her aunt that she had best go and remind Uncle Marchcroft that horses did not, in fact, wait for pie. Ivy went. She would think, afterward, that a great many small honest actions had strung themselves together to bring her to the moment. She would think that if she had not gone to fetch her uncle, if she had not paused in the covered passage, if the innkeeper's boy had not been quick, if the second team of the Duke's carriage had not been brought out at the same instant as the second team of the hire carriage, if the two vehicles had not been drawn up almost nose to tail at the near end of the yard, so that from the covered passage the two doors looked, in the pale sun, exactly alike, she would never have opened the wrong door. But she did. She had come back with her uncle, or thought she had, and had heard her aunt's voice from a carriage window saying, "Ivy, do come, do come," and had gone to the nearer of the two dark blue doors, with her valise in one hand and her parcel of sandwiches in the other, and had, in the smooth, trained motion of a woman who had climbed into 50 hired carriages in her life, put her foot upon the step and her hand upon the frame, and swung herself up into the interior. The door was closed behind her by a groom who had been given very clear instructions from his own coachman, and who was quite certain the young lady in gray was one of the passengers he had been told to expect. The groom said, "Mind your feet, miss," and shut the door, and turned to spring up behind. The horses moved. The wheels shifted upon the wet cobbles. The yard, which had been waiting for movement, moved. From the other carriage, the Marchcroft carriage, at the same instant, Aunt Marchcroft leaned out of the window to snap that Ivy must come now, and saw, with a small confused startle, that Ivy was already in the carriage that was moving off. That dark plain carriage which no Marchcroft would ever have dared open. Delphine, at the window, in her peach pelisse, saw it and did not, for a full breath, understand what she saw. Cassandra, in the corner, saw nothing, because she was reading the first page of the novel she had never opened. Uncle Marchcroft, emerging from the inn with a napkin still tucked into his collar, saw only the receding lamp of a vehicle that was not his, and assumed a stranger had left. Aunt Marchcroft opened her mouth to shout and shut it again, because she was, above all, a woman who did not shout at dukes. And so, without a single voice raised to warn her, without a hand upon her sleeve to stop her, without the smallest word from her family to save her from the mistake, Ivy Marchcroft sat down in the interior of the carriage she had entered, and only then did she look up. The interior was dim, quiet, and clean. The upholstery was a deep blue-gray, unpatterned, of a fabric so soft under her ungloved fingertip that she registered the touch as a warmth. A folded rug of dark wool lay across the seat opposite. A small polished box was set into the wall beside the door, with the initials of no family upon it, only a plain lozenge picked out in silver. The window's inner curtain was drawn back with a linen tie. 2 people were in the carriage. One was a small-boned lady in a plum traveling dress and a bonnet trimmed with a black ribbon, sitting composedly with her hands folded upon a book. The other was a tall man in a plain dark coat, taking up the corner opposite hers, one boot crossed lightly over the other, his eyes upon the wet window and his gloves upon his knee. Ivy heard, quite clearly, the small polite voice inside her that had been trained for the parlor of a mediocre aunt say, "Oh God." She did not say it aloud. She sat, with the valise upon her lap and the parcel of sandwiches under one arm, and looked at Lady Sabine Ashenvale and Adrian, Duke of Ashenvale, and did not, for a moment, know how a person breathed. It was Lady Sabine who spoke first, and she did so without turning her head sharply and without lifting her voice, and Ivy would remember, later, that it was this restraint above all which persuaded her, in the first useless second, that she had walked into a room where the trouble one made was small. "Well," said Lady Sabine, in a light, dry tone that could have belonged to any drawing room in England. "This is unexpected." Ivy, who had been raised by her mother to answer such tones truthfully, and by her aunt to answer them with excuses, chose, in the second in which she chose anything, her mother. "I have entered the wrong carriage," she said. "I beg your pardon. I must ask you to stop." There was a small pause. The Duke, without turning his head from the window, said in a voice as level as a table, "We are past the yard," and Ivy, hearing the flat honesty of it, and not the discourtesy, felt the ground beneath her steady itself under her feet as if she had, without meaning to, learned something. Lady Sabine's eyes had gone, in this pause, to the brooch at Ivy's throat and had noted the mended shoulder seam of the cloak, and had marked with a professional, unsurprised recognition the fact that the young woman opposite was neither trembling nor apologizing, and was also, quite clearly, mortified. She said, with the smallest possible bend of her mouth, "Well, if we have you, we may as well have your name." "Ivy Marchcroft," said Ivy. "Of Haversham, though I was not going to Haversham. I was traveling to Ashenvale under Wynne." A small silence moved through the carriage like a person changing seats. Lady Sabine, who had not blinked, turned her face, at last, minutely toward her brother, and her brother, at last, turned his face from the window. He did not look at Ivy first. He looked at his sister with the expression of a man who has, for years, been reading his sister's face for footnotes. Whatever he read there, he set down in some inner ledger without visible change. Then his eyes came to Ivy. She had expected, in the second of anticipation, a cold appraisal, because she had been appraised coldly all her life by people less exacting than a duke, and had, in that second, prepared for the small hardening at the mouth, the flick of interest that becomes a flick of dismissal, the assigned diminishment. What she met was a look. It was not warm. It was not cold. It was assessing, unhurried, and, she thought without the language for it, honest, in the way of a man who had learned that lying with the eyes was more expensive than lying with the tongue. He took in the gray cloak and the mended seam and the small silver brooch and the valise that was too old and the parcel of sandwiches that was too plain, and he took in, at the same time, though she did not know this then, the calm level of her breath, the fact that her hands upon the valise were still, that her chin, though lowered from politeness, was not lowered from shame. He said quietly, "Miss Marchcroft, if you are traveling to Ashenvale under Wynne, then you and I are by accident going the same way." Ivy did not speak. It was Lady Sabine, whose reading of a moment was quicker than any woman's Ivy had ever met, who added, with the same light dryness, "The horses have been changed, the coachman has orders, and to descend now upon the open road in this weather, with your valise and your parcel and no attendant, would be neither safe nor sensible. We will carry you as far as the next stop, at least. There you may send word to your people." It was not a question. It was not entirely a permission, either. It was the sound of a decision being made in a family that had been making decisions for a great many centuries. Ivy inclined her head. "Thank you," she said. "I am very sorry." "There is no need for sorrow," said Lady Sabine, "only for tea," and she reached, with the easy authority of a hostess who considered any moving vehicle her drawing room, for the small polished box in the wall, from which she produced a stoppered flask and 3 cups no larger than eggs, and she poured, and she offered, and Ivy, who had been trained by mercy starved years to accept small kindnesses without exclaiming, accepted with the smallest possible warmth in her voice, and did not once spill. The Duke did not take a cup. He watched the road. He said, "Without turning his head, we will overtake the Marchcroft carriage within a mile." I saw them in the yard. Ivy's face did not change, but Lady Sabine, who was watching for the change that did not come, remarked to herself, in her private hall of observations, that girl again, and this time with a small, considering interest that was almost, but not quite, a smile. And so the Duke's dark plain carriage went out through the gate of the coaching inn at Haversham on a wet October morning in 1812, with the wrong woman inside it, and the wrong woman sat with a valise upon her knees and a parcel of sandwiches under her arm, and a violet brooch at her throat, and did not tremble, and did not weep, and did not know that at the very moment the wheels crossed the threshold of the yard, Lady Sabine Ashenvale had already begun, in the silent, orderly, ferociously loyal engine of her mind, to arrange a future she had not, an hour before, known she would arrange. The road out of Haversham ran between low hedges the color of tarnished copper and past fields whose plowed earth was so wet it shone almost black. Sheep, small and unimpressed, watched the carriage pass with the flat interest that livestock reserve for things that will not eat them. A pair of magpies quarreled on a gatepost and did not stop quarreling as the wheels went by. Ivy set her cup upon the little rack that fitted into the wall, folded her hands over the parcel of sandwiches so that it did not slide, and sat very upright, because she had decided, in the moment between accepting the cup and swallowing from it, that she would not spend the next mile behaving as though she had committed a crime for which she must be visibly punished. She had committed a mistake. She would sit inside it as though it were a small tidy room. Lady Sabine, on the seat opposite, closed her book upon her finger to mark the page, and considered Ivy over the top of it, with the concentrated stillness of a woman doing sums in her head. The Duke, in the corner, watched the road. It was the Duke who broke the silence, and he did so with a question so plain it did not sound like a question at all. "What business have you at Ashenvale, under Wynne, Miss Marchcroft?" Ivy, who had been asked her business twice a week for 7 years by an aunt who did not want to hear it, drew the small, quiet breath she had learned to draw before an honest answer, and said, "I am to help Mrs. Dorrington establish a subscription library, and to teach 3 afternoons a week at the girls' school her late husband founded." There was a pause. The Duke did not look at her. He said, "Mrs. Dorrington of the White House." "That is the name," said Ivy. He had known Mrs. Dorrington. Ivy could not see how she knew he had known Mrs. Dorrington. She only knew it from something in the way he had received the name, the small internal nod of a man setting a new fact into an existing shelf. "Then," he said, and this Ivy would remember afterward as the moment when the road she had been traveling upon her whole life bent, without warning, 1 degree away from the road on which she had been born. "A subscription library requires shelves." "Yes," said Ivy. "And light." "Yes," said Ivy. "And a plan." "I have one," said Ivy, before she could stop herself and heard her own voice, and did not, this time, blush. Lady Sabine's book closed entirely upon her finger. "Show me," said the Duke, without turning his head, and Ivy, who had never in her life been asked by any person in authority to show anything she had made, opened her account book upon her lap, took the folded square of paper from between its pages, and offered it across the small moving distance between them. His hand, which was ungloved now, took it. He unfolded it upon his own knee. He looked at the shelves, which she had numbered. He looked at the reading room window, which she had annotated for the direction of the winter light. He looked at the small pencil note in her hand that said, on a line by itself, "Benches at the wall are cheaper than chairs and hold more children." He did not smile. He did not need to. He said, Quietly, Miss Marchcroft. This is competent work. Ivy, who had prepared herself for a dozen tones and had not prepared herself for this one, kept her hands still upon the account book and said, "Thank you." Lady Sabine's eyes had gone, at that word, from the sketch upon her brother's knee to Ivy's face, and had stayed there. She said nothing yet. She was, in her private hall of observations, moving pieces upon a board Ivy could not see. The carriage went on through the wet hedges, and overtook, within the promised mile, a hired blue carriage moving at a pace suited to the appetite of a florid gentleman who had not quite finished his pie. From the window of the hired carriage, as the Duke's dark plain carriage passed, 3 faces were visible. Aunt Marchcroft's, wide and horrified. Delphine's, in her peach pelisse arranged for print. Cassandra's, at last understanding that her novel had begun. None of them saw Ivy, who had, without meaning to, chosen the seat that faced the far window and was therefore, from the road, a shadow. The Duke's carriage passed them without slowing, and Lady Sabine, glancing once at the hired carriage as it fell behind, remarked, in a tone light enough to be mistaken for indifference, "We shall stop at the Rose and Compass. It is only 3 miles on." She said it to Ivy. She said it to her brother. She said it, above all, to herself. And in the small silence that followed, as the wheels of the dark plain carriage cleared a shallow puddle with a soft, decisive sound, Lady Sabine Ashenvale, sister to the Duke of Ashenvale, mistress of a great many things and a great many people, folded her book shut upon her lap, laid her hands over it, and let the smallest movement of a smile cross her mouth, no wider than a thread. And thought, in the exact private words she would deny using if ever asked, "Well then, that will do." The road bent. The hedges thickened. The pale sun at last gave up entirely, and the fields without complaint went a soft, patient gray. The Rose and Compass stood at a bend of the North Road, where a small stone bridge lifted the highway over a stream that in October ran the color of strong tea, and its sign, a red rose crossed by a brass mariner's needle, hung from an iron bracket that had been polished within the last week. This, Ivy noted, was not the polishing of a common inn. This was the polishing of a house that had been given warning that a particular carriage might pass. The yard, when they turned into it, was already swept, the trough already scoured, the ostler already at the horses' heads, before the wheels had ceased to move. A woman in a starched apron stood in the doorway, with her hands folded and her eyes down, and did not lift them until Lady Sabine had descended. Then she curtsied once, briefly and low, and said, "My lady, the parlor is ready." Lady Sabine, who had made no arrangement of any kind before leaving Haversham, thanked her with the calm of a person who had expected exactly this, and would have been mildly interested had it been otherwise. The Duke handed his sister down. He handed Ivy down. His gloved hand under her ungloved one was steady, brief, and impersonal, and he released her the moment her foot was on the stone, and yet Ivy, walking under the low lintel of the Rose and Compass, with her valise in her hand and her cloak damp at the hem, felt the small burn where his palm had been. The way one feels a coin one has been given by a stranger and does not yet know how to spend. The private parlor smelled of applewood and beeswax and, faintly, of the lavender that had been laid between the linen on the sideboard. A fire had been lit. A table had been set for 3 in plain, well-kept ware, with a jug of small beer and a covered dish of something that steamed. A settle stood along the wall beside the fire, a writing desk beside the window, and on the desk, in a stack, sheets of clean paper and a good ink. Ivy set her valise down against the settle and her parcel of sandwiches beside it, and did not, at once, sit. Lady Sabine did. Lady Sabine untied her bonnet, laid it upon the settle with the composure of a woman removing a mask no one had known she was wearing, and looked at Ivy with the direct, undisguised interest of a person who has now decided that she has time. "Come and eat something," she said. "You have not eaten." Ivy came. She did not, on principle, refuse hospitality, because her mother had taught her that refusal was as much a boast as acceptance was, and less useful. She sat opposite Lady Sabine at the small table, and the Duke, who had crossed to the window and set his hand against the sill, said, without turning, "We shall be here 2 hours. The horses need it. And Miss Marchcroft's people are, at present, 3 miles behind us upon the road." Ivy, spreading a napkin upon her lap, said, "They will not stop." There was a small pause. The Duke turned his face very slightly, not enough to look at her, but enough that she felt herself, in his peripheral vision, seen. "Why will they not stop?" he said. "Because they will not have understood," said Ivy, calmly, "that they should. My aunt will assume I have made a scene, and it is my aunt's rule that a scene is best left where it is made. She will drive on to the next inn and expect me to have found my own way there. It is a very old rule in our house." Lady Sabine, who had been in the act of lifting the cover from the dish, set it down again with the smallest possible click, and looked at her brother. Her brother did not look back. He said only, "Then Miss Marchcroft's people are fools," in a voice so level that the sentence did not sound like an insult, only like a fact he had verified. He turned then and came to the table, and sat and helped himself, and did not once invite Ivy to feel that she had been the topic. The meal was a plain one, and an excellent one, a pigeon pie with a good crust, a dish of new potatoes with butter, bread, still warm, a slice of cheese the color of straw. Ivy ate as she had been taught to eat by a mother who had understood that hunger was not a manner, and that pretending to it was, and Lady Sabine ate with the quick attention of a woman who had been traveling since before dawn, and the Duke ate as men eat who have long since ceased to notice food. It was Lady Sabine who first steered the talk, and she did so with the delicacy of a person who did not, as a rule, waste steering. "The sketch," she said. "May I see it?" Ivy passed it across the table with the calm of a woman who had already been asked once and had not, on that first asking, come to grief. Lady Sabine unfolded it, laid it flat beside her plate, waited a corner with the salt cellar, and read it as her brother had read it, from the shelves upward. She did not, at first, speak. She turned the paper a quarter, then a quarter again, then flat once more. She said, "At last you have numbered the shelves for the eye, and not for the alphabet." "I have," said Ivy. Because a child looking for a book does not know the alphabet from the outside," said Ivy, before she could stop herself, "but she knows a low shelf from a high one, and she knows a red spine from a green, and she will find the low shelves first because her hand is at that height. I have set the histories high, because a person who wants a history will look up, and the storybooks at the low shelf, because a child will look down." Lady Sabine did not smile. She said, "And the reading room window?" "It faces south," said Ivy, "but a south light in winter is a shallow light, and it will not reach the far corner unless the desks are turned." "I have turned the desks." Lady Sabine looked at her brother. Her brother, who had been eating, set down his knife, wiped his mouth, and said, "Miss Marchcroft, who taught you to plan a room?" Ivy hesitated. It was not a hesitation of shame. It was a hesitation of accuracy, because it mattered to her, as it always mattered to her, that she named the right person. "My mother," she said. "Ah," said the Duke, and did not press further, and Ivy was, without knowing why, grateful. Lady Sabine, having weighted the sketch with the salt cellar, now lifted a corner and let it fall again, and asked, in a tone she made deliberately light, "And Mrs. Dorrington, she wrote for you?" "Yes," said Ivy. "She has written to my aunt, offering me a home for the winter and a small salary, and my aunt has consented on the condition that I not require anything of her family for my clothes or my keep upon my return." Lady Sabine's fork paused a fraction of a second above her plate. "Her return," she said, without inflection. Ivy, who had heard her own words after speaking them, considered them and did not, this time, blush. "That was the condition," she said. It was not, she chose not to add, the intention. The Duke, who had not spoken, said, "Then you had best make the library a success, Miss Marchcroft, so that Mrs. Dorrington may find you indispensable." Ivy set down her knife. She had been called useful all her life by people who meant that she was disposable so long as she was polite about it, and it startled her, in a way she could not have named without falling into her own trap, to hear the word replaced by another that carried a different weight. Indispensable, she turned the word over, once upon her tongue, and did not speak it aloud. She said instead, "I intend to." It was not a boast. It sounded like a promise made to herself in a voice her mother would have recognized. Lady Sabine, without visible triumph, refolded the sketch along its original creases and returned it across the table with both hands, as a person returns a document that has weight. "Keep it safe," she said. "There are people in this county who would sign such a plan and pretend they had thought of it." Ivy took it back and slid it once more between the pages of her account book and, unable to help it entirely, met Lady Sabine's eye. Lady Sabine's eye, she found, was already there, and in that meeting, brief as it was, brief as one page against another before a book shuts, a small, unspoken thing passed between them that was neither friendship yet, nor conspiracy yet, but something more useful than either, an agreement to notice. The rain came in earnest then, against the parlor window, in a soft, slanted sheet. The Duke rose, walked to the window, stood with his hand upon the sill and his back to the room, and said, without turning, "We shall not overtake the weather. We must sit with it." "Sit then," said Lady Sabine, and reached for the small polished box that stood upon the sideboard, and drew from it a little traveling writing case that was clearly her own, and settled herself with paper and pen at the writing desk by the window, and began, with the neat, quick, unornamented hand of a woman who had written a great many letters in her life, to write. Ivy, having nothing to do with her hands but wait, drew from her valise the account book and a plain lead pencil, opened the book upon her knee, and began to correct a small error in a column of figures she had noticed the day before and had had no light to correct in the coach. She did not look up. She heard the Duke turn from the window, cross the room to the settle by the fire, sit, take up a folded paper from the small stack he had produced from an inner pocket of his coat, and begin, without ceremony, to read. For half an hour there was in the parlor only the sound of the rain, the low crack of the applewood, the scratch of Lady Sabine's pen, the small dry rustle of the Duke's paper, and, from Ivy's corner, the almost inaudible tick of a pencil against a page. It was, Ivy thought, without meaning to think it, one of the most peaceful half-hours of her life. She did not name the piece. She only noticed, in the way one notices that a headache one had grown used to has lifted, that no one in the room was waiting for her to be smaller than she was. She turned the page. She corrected another column. The Duke, without looking up, said, "Miss Marchcroft, do you keep the household accounts?" "Yes," said Ivy. "Since when?" "Since I was 16, said Ivy. "And who audits them?" said the Duke, whose eyes had not left his paper. "My uncle looks at the totals," said Ivy, once a quarter. He does not read the columns. He is not a reader of columns. It was not, in her mouth, a criticism. It was a statement of the kind Ivy made about her uncle when asked, without heat and without loyalty, because she had been asked. The Duke's mouth moved, very slightly, at one corner, as though he had heard a small joke that had not been made for him. He did not smile. He said, "Then your uncle has been fortunate in his auditor." Ivy did not answer. It was not, she felt, a sentence that required an answer. Lady Sabine, at the writing desk, laid down her pen and turned in her chair. "Adrian," she said, in the voice of a sister who has come to a decision. The Duke lifted his eyes. "If we are to sit 2 hours," she said, "and the road is under water, and Miss Marchcroft's people have gone on and will not return, then I propose we make Miss Marchcroft useful." Ivy's head came up. The word had not been said unkindly. It had, in fact, been said with a small, deliberate lightness, as one says a word whose weight one intends to change. Lady Sabine met her eye without apology. "It is your word," she said, plainly. "I have heard your aunt use it. I have used it too, of other women, and been ashamed. Let us take it back. I propose we borrow you for the afternoon, Miss Marchcroft, and pay you for it." Ivy said, with her mother's calm, "I do not know what you would pay me for." "For copying," said Lady Sabine. "Cleanly, I have 3 letters to my mother, 1 to a tenant and 1 to a solicitor, and my hand is quick, but my brother's clerk is at the other end of the county, and I will not send my mother a letter blotted with the ink of my own impatience. If you will copy fair from my drafts, I shall pay you a shilling a page, which is, I am told, the going rate for a fair hand. And if you decline, I shall be forced to tell my mother that the rain kept me, and she will never believe me. Because she has never believed me about the rain." It was said lightly. It was said, Ivy understood at once, in order to allow her to accept without shame. She looked at the writing desk. She looked at the pen. She looked, once, quickly, at the Duke, who had returned his eyes to his paper as if the conversation did not concern him, and was, in that studied disinterest, permitting her the choice. Ivy said, "I will not take a shilling a page. I will take the meal I have already had, and the shelter from the rain, and the ride to the next stop." Lady Sabine, without moving her face, said, "Very well, and you shall also take a shilling a page, because I do not accept charity from strangers, Miss Marchcroft, and I will not offer it either. Come, there is a chair." The chair was drawn out. Ivy went to it. She sat. She was handed a draft in a hand that was, as promised, quick but not blotted, and clean paper, and a good pen. She read the draft once entirely before dipping the pen, because her mother had taught her that to copy without reading was to insult both the writer and the recipient. And then she began to write, and her hand, which had been trained upon her aunt's account books and her mother's old letters, and the labels of every jar in every cupboard she had ever been given charge of, moved across the paper with the steady grace of a hand that had long ago stopped needing to think about being watched. Lady Sabine watched, once, briefly, and did not watch again. She had seen what she needed to see. The rain went on. The applewood cracked. The Duke, from the settle, said, "Without looking up, Sabine, has your solicitor written yet upon the matter of the North Field?" "Not yet," said Lady Sabine, and rose, and crossed to him, and stood a moment at his shoulder reading over the paper he held. Ivy, without meaning to, glanced up. The paper in the Duke's hand was folded lengthwise, cross-written in a dense hand at one corner, and was, from the small distance of her chair, unreadable. What was readable was the way his sister's hand came to rest, for the briefest instant, upon his shoulder, and the way he did not shrug it away. Ivy returned her eyes to her own page and did not look up again. It was in this quiet, in this scratching of pens and cracking of applewood and slow, steady patience of the rain against a good window that the door opened. It opened without a knock, which was, at the Rose and Compass, a discourtesy of a size that only one class of person permitted themselves. A gentleman came in, shaking rain from a caped coat, and behind him a lady in a bonnet so wet its ribbons had darkened to black. They were followed by the woman in the starched apron, who was murmuring apologies and had not, quite, been able to prevent them from coming. "My lord," she said, "my lady, the private parlor is engaged." The gentleman, who was tall and florid and wore a coat that had once been very fine and was now a season out, laughed the laugh of a man who did not intend to be prevented from anything, and said, "Oh, nonsense, we are all friends of the road, and my dear wife is soaked through. We shall crowd in for a quarter of an hour, and no one shall be the worse." The lady, small and pale and shivering, said nothing, but her eyes, as she came into the light, went at once to the fire with the honest greed of a person who is cold. Lady Sabine, who had not moved from her brother's shoulder, said in a tone perfectly cordial and perfectly cool, "Of course, sir. Come to the fire. Your name." The gentleman, straightening as he came into the light and recognizing, at last, whom he was addressing, produced a bow of the exact depth he calculated he could afford. "Sir Peveril Crane," he said, "at your service, my lady, your grace, and my wife, Lady Crane." She had, he thought, said, was a Ludworth of the Ludworths in Suffolk. The Duke, without rising, inclined his head 1/4 of an inch. Sir Peveril's eyes, having done their duty by the Duke, now travelled the room and stopped upon Ivy at the writing-desk with her pen still in her hand. "Ah," he said, delighted, "my niece." "My niece by marriage indeed, though I had not thought to find her here." "Miss Marchcroft, you rogue. You did not tell me you had noble company upon the road." Ivy, whose pen had not moved, set it carefully down in its rest. She had not seen Sir Peveril Crane in 3 years. He was not, in any accurate sense, her uncle. He was the second husband of a cousin of her aunt's, who was no longer living, and the connection had been slight even during that cousin's life. He had, during that life, borrowed money of Ivy's father and had not returned it, and had, upon her father's death, sent a letter of condolence that had not once mentioned the money. His wife, Lady Crane, whom he had married 18 months after the first Lady Crane's funeral, was pale and cold, and had, Ivy suspected, been taught by 3 months of marriage to say very little in her husband's presence. "Sir Peveril," said Ivy, quietly, "come to the fire, sir. Your lady is chilled." Sir Peveril laughed again. He came to the fire. He held his hands to it. He turned so that the fire warmed his back, and the room could see his coat. He said, over his shoulder to Lady Sabine, "My dear little Miss Marchcroft, always the useful one, always the useful one. My late wife used to say that of her. Delphine will marry well, and Cassandra will marry sweetly, but Ivy will be useful all her days." "There it is," said the Duke, softly. He did not say it to Sir Peveril. He said it so quietly that only Lady Sabine and Ivy heard it, to no one at all, in the tone of a man who has just watched a familiar figure walk into the room he had been describing. Lady Sabine, without turning her head, said, "Sir Peveril, may I offer you a cup of anything hot?" It was the courtesy of a hostess who wished the guest gone within the quarter hour she had granted him. Sir Peveril, who did not read such courtesies, accepted with great pleasure and remained an hour. In that hour a great many things were said that Ivy had heard before, in the mouths of a great many people, but never before in the presence of a man whose stillness she had begun, without meaning to measure herself against. Sir Peveril spoke of horses, and of his own horses, and of a horse he had once nearly bought. He spoke of the road, and of the state of it, and of the sorts of persons one now met upon it. He spoke, drifting, of the Marchcrofts, whom he called dear old George and dear silly Louisa, and of Delphine, of whom he said, with a lick of the lip he did not know he had given, that she was ripening into as pretty a thing as had been seen in the county in 10 years, and of Cassandra, of whom he said nothing, having forgotten her, and of Ivy. Of Ivy he said 3 separate times in that hour, each time as if it were a fresh observation, that she was the useful one. Each time he said it, Ivy, at her writing desk, dipped her pen once more, and did not lift her eyes. Each time he said it, Lady Sabine, from her brother's shoulder, met the Duke's eye and said nothing. Each time he said it, the Duke's mouth did not move, but a small, definite line appeared for an instant between his brows, and was gone, when at last Sir Peveril had drunk the hot drink that had been brought him, and his wife had thought enough to speak in a low, unhurried whisper about the state of the road ahead, and the ostler had put his head in at the door to say that their carriage was ready and their horses were fresh. Sir Peveril rose, took his wife's arm as if she were a coat, and bowed to the room. "Your Grace, my lady, dear little Ivy." Then he stopped. He had turned to go. He turned back. He said, with the expression of a man who has just remembered a small trump card in his pocket, "Dear little Ivy, before I forget entirely, you will wish to know that I received, only last week, from a source I shall not name, a letter that concerns you." Ivy, whose pen was in her hand, laid it down for the second time. "What letter?" said Lady Sabine, before Ivy could speak. Ivy would remember this for years. She would remember that Lady Sabine had spoken for her, not over her, not instead of her, but before her, in the tone of a woman who did not intend to let a threat cross a room unattended. Sir Peveril, who had not expected to be answered by the Duke's sister, hesitated the smallest possible hesitation, and rallied. "It is not a letter I have," he said. "It is a letter I have heard of." "A letter," he added, delicately, "that names Miss Marchcroft as having been present, unchaperoned, in a gentleman's rooms in Haversham this last May." "A letter," he added, more delicately still, "that describes what she was doing there." He smiled. He wished, in that smile, both to seem grieved on Ivy's behalf and to seem to the Duke a man who was, at least, willing to bring bad news. Ivy did not move. She had, this last May, been in Haversham for 3 days at the house of a Mrs. Ellis, an elderly widow who taught drawing and to whom Ivy had gone for lessons paid for out of her own savings. She had not been in any gentleman's rooms. She had been in Mrs. Ellis's parlor with 2 other girls and Mrs. Ellis's spaniel, and had drawn, from memory, a bowl of pears and a candlestick. She said, without heat, "That is a lie." Sir Peveril raised his eyebrows in mild surprise. "My dear," he said, "I do not say it is true. I say only that there is such a letter, that it is being shown at certain tables in the county, and that your aunt has heard of it, and is, poor lady, distressed. I thought only to warn you. One must warn one's own family." He bowed again. He went. His wife followed. The door shut. The rain, which had thinned, thickened again. For a full second, no one in the parlor spoke. Then Lady Sabine came away from her brother's shoulder, crossed the room in 3 even steps, and stopped beside Ivy's chair. She did not touch her. She said, quietly, "That man is a liar. So is anyone in this county who repeats what he says." Ivy, who had gripped the pen and had not known she had gripped it, opened her hand and laid it flat upon the desk. She said, in the voice she used to correct a column of figures, "I was not in any gentleman's rooms in May." Lady Sabine said, "I know that." Ivy, who had expected to be believed after a delay of several sentences, and to have to argue for the belief, looked up. Lady Sabine's face was calm, exact, and quite settled, and behind the calm was a small, hot furnace of a temper Ivy had not known was there. "How?" said Ivy, before she could stop the word. "Because," said Lady Sabine, "I do not require reasons to believe a woman I have watched for 2 hours, because I have seen your hand, because I have seen your sketch. Because a woman who plans a reading room for a child's height does not spend an afternoon in a gentleman's rooms. And because Sir Peveril Crane, who has just left this parlor, borrowed £100 of my brother's steward 6 years ago, and has not returned a shilling, and I do not believe a word that man says about weather, let alone about women." She said all of this in the tone she had used to ask for the tea. Ivy discovered at that moment that her eyes had filled. She did not let them spill. She turned her face to the paper on the desk and blinked once, hard, and the tears went, as tears will when a woman has practiced, back into the private hall where she kept them. The Duke, from the settle, had risen at some point during Sir Peveril's speech and had not sat down again. He stood at the window with his back to the room. He said, without turning, "When did Sir Peveril last dine at Haversham?" Ivy did not know why he asked. Then she did. She said, at once, 6 weeks ago. "He came for 2 nights. He borrowed my uncle's dinner coat, and when he came," said the Duke, still not turning, "was he shown my aunt's cabinet of miniatures, in which, I believe, there is a small portrait of you as a girl of 15, painted by a Mrs. Ellis of Haversham." Ivy stared at the back of the Duke's coat. She said slowly, "Yes, he asked to see the miniatures. My aunt showed them all." "Mrs. Ellis," said the Duke, without any particular emphasis, "is, I gather, the drawing mistress you visited last May." "Yes," said Ivy, "and in the corner of that miniature," he said, "is there not a small inscription in a hand that is not Mrs. Ellis's, being your mother's hand, that reads, my Ivy, 7 years old at the fair?" Ivy, whose breath had gone shallow, said, "Yes." Her mother had written it in the corner, and it had never come out. It had been a private joke between them that she looked, at 15, exactly as she had looked at 7. She had not painted the miniature. Mrs. Ellis had. Her mother had written on it after. Lady Sabine said, softly, "Oh, Adrian." "Yes," said the Duke, at last turning. "If Sir Peveril has invented, or has been sold, a letter that claims Miss Marchcroft was in a gentleman's rooms in Haversham this last May, and if the letter, as such letters do, offers as evidence a description of Miss Marchcroft's person, or a fragment of her handwriting, or a specific date, then we may check it against a single detail. If the letter names a date in May, we may compare it against Mrs. Ellis's book, which will show every hour Miss Marchcroft spent under her roof. If the letter attempts to imitate Miss Marchcroft's hand, we may compare it against the inscription in the miniature, which is not her hand at all, but her mother's, and which any forger who had heard only that Miss Marchcroft is called useful will have assumed was her own." Ivy sat perfectly still. She had, she realized, been holding her breath. "It is one anomaly," said the Duke. "It is enough." Lady Sabine, without lifting her voice, said, "We must get to the miniature before he does. Sir Peveril will not have thought so quickly, but he has friends who do." Ivy, whose brain had come, at last, up out of the ditch into which shock had thrown it, said, "Mrs. Ellis has her book still. She keeps every appointment. She wrote in it before me, twice, in May. I know the days. She will lend it to me if I ask. My aunt has the miniature." "Aunt Marchcroft," said Lady Sabine dryly, "will not lend a miniature to a person she has denied a Christmas ribbon. There must be another way." "There is another way," said Ivy, and it was her voice, and it did not shake. Grandmother Whitcomb. There was a small silence. The Duke, who had not sat down, looked at his sister. Lady Sabine's mouth moved a fraction toward a smile. "Whitcomb," she said. "Old Lady Whitcomb, of Whitcomb Grange." "My mother's mother," said Ivy. "She lives 10 miles east of Ashenvale under Wynne. She has not spoken to my aunt in 11 years, since my aunt refused to allow me to spend Christmases with her. She has, in a locked drawer of her writing desk, 3 miniatures my mother painted of me, and 1 Mrs. Ellis painted, of which my aunt does not know she has copies. She has all of my mother's letters. She has my mother's own book of drawings, in which the same hand that wrote in the corner of Mrs. Ellis's miniature has written on 100 pages. She will lend me any of it. She will lend it me tonight if I write. She would come herself if I asked. She has been waiting 7 years to be asked." Ivy stopped. She had not, she realized, spoken so many consecutive sentences aloud at once in her aunt's house in 7 years. The Duke's face did not change. But Lady Sabine, who had crossed the room again during Ivy's speech, laid her hand, at last, upon Ivy's shoulder for the space of a breath, and Ivy, who had not been touched with kindness by a woman since her mother's death, except by Mrs. Dorrington at a Christmas 6 years past, held very still under it. "Then write to her," said Lady Sabine. "Write to her now. My brother's man will carry the letter tonight upon my brother's fastest horse, and old Lady Whitcomb will have it before breakfast." "Adrian," the Duke inclined his head. "It is done," he said. Ivy took a fresh sheet of paper. She dipped the pen. She wrote, in the hand her grandmother had watched grow up from the round childish loops of 8 years old to the neat controlled adult hand of the letter she had sent last month, 5 plain sentences that named the lie, named the miniature, named Mrs. Ellis, named Sir Peveril, and named the day. She signed the letter. She sealed it. She gave it to the Duke, and the Duke gave it to a servant, and the servant went, and the horse went, and the rain went on, and the parlor, for a while, was quieter than any parlor Ivy had ever sat in. It was Lady Sabine, after some time, who said, quietly, "Miss Marchcroft, you will not go on to Mrs. Dorrington's tonight." Ivy looked up. "Not," said Lady Sabine, "because you are unwelcome upon your road. Because it is not safe for you upon your road. Sir Peveril will have gone straight to my Aunt Louisa, forgive me, to your Aunt Louisa, and told her his story with such delicacy that she will believe him. Your aunt will send word ahead of you. There will be, at Mrs. Dorrington's door tomorrow, whispers you cannot answer without evidence you do not yet have. You will come with us to Ashenvale House tonight. You will sleep in a bed that is dry. My mother, who does not bite, will feed you a breakfast. And by breakfast you will have the miniature and Mrs. Ellis's book and Lady Whitcomb herself, if I know her, on the seat of her own carriage in the drive. Then you will go to Mrs. Dorrington with the evidence in your hand, and not without it." Ivy, hearing herself invited to sleep at the Duke's house, felt her mother's aphorism go through her like a small clean bell. A woman with a voice does not need a loud one. A woman with a place does not need to be given it by others. She had not, until now, quite understood the second half. She said, in a voice that did not shake, "Thank you. I accept." "Very well," said Lady Sabine, and rose, and in the tone of a woman resuming a domestic list interrupted by a small trifle, added, "And now the horses." Adrian, the Duke, who had not spoken during Lady Sabine's speech, said, quietly, "One moment, Sabine," and turned to Ivy and looked at her for the first time in an hour with the direct look he had given her in the carriage, and said, "Miss Marchcroft, when the letter of which Sir Peveril speaks is produced, and it will be produced, because a lie of that size is not born in one man's mouth alone. We shall not answer it in whispers. We shall answer it plainly and in the day. You will not have to defend yourself alone." Ivy, whose hands were flat upon the desk, said, "That is more than I have any right to ask." "It is nothing to do with rights," said the Duke, and then, after a fraction of a second, in a voice that was quieter still, "And it has, I find, everything to do with what is owed." He did not explain the sentence. He did not look away. Ivy, who did not know what he meant by owed, and who understood from something under his voice that he did not entirely know either, inclined her head. The words sat in the room like a small warm coal on a hearthstone. Lady Sabine, who had heard it, made no observation whatever. She only said, gently, "Come." The parlor was gathered. The account book was returned to the valise. The sketch was folded once more between its pages. The parcel of sandwiches, which had never been opened, was pressed by Ivy upon the woman in the starched apron for whichever child of the yard was smallest, and the woman took it with a curtsy. The cloak was fastened. The bonnet, which had scarcely been off, was retied. Ivy's hand, at her throat, touched the violet brooch, as one touches a small silver thing to be sure it is still there, and the brooch, in the fingers of a woman who had been called useful and had, for the first time in her life, been called competent instead, sat as steady as it had ever sat. In the yard the horses were fresh. The lamps had been lit. The rain, tired at last, had thinned to a small persistent mist that made the road ahead a pearl-gray ribbon into a country Ivy had never seen. The Duke handed his sister up. He handed Ivy up. His gloved hand, this time, was not brief. It rested a small measurable second beneath her fingers and released her and closed the door. He said something to the coachman that Ivy did not hear. He came up into the carriage after them. He sat in the corner opposite Ivy, took up his gloves upon his knee, and looked, at once, out of the window. The lamps swung. The wheels turned. The rose and compass, sign polished, apron curtsying, receded into the mist behind them like a small good thing that had done its work and could now rest. Lady Sabine, who had opened her book and had not, for the first mile, turned a page, said at last, without looking up, "Adrian, yes," said the Duke. "You know that Mamma, when she hears of this, will keep Miss Marchcroft. Mamma will do as she likes," said the Duke. "Which is," said Lady Sabine mildly, "precisely what I said." The Duke did not answer. Ivy, in her corner, watched a hedge go by that seemed to run alongside them in the mist as though pacing them, and did not, quite, allow herself to think of Ashenvale House, because she had learned in 23 years that to picture a room before one had entered it was often to be embarrassed by the room one did in fact enter. She thought, instead, of her grandmother. She thought of the letter racing east upon a good horse in the wet. She thought of the miniature in a locked drawer in a house she had not seen in 7 years, with her mother's writing in the corner. She thought of Mrs. Ellis's book, in which every hour was set down in a careful hand. She thought of Sir Peveril, warming his back at a fire that was not his. She thought, briefly, of the voice at the coaching inn that had said useful is a comfort in a household, and she found, without triumph, that she was no longer afraid of it. It went on raining, softly, against the glass. Ivy said, quietly, into the small hush of the wheels, "My mother used to say that a woman with a voice does not need a loud one, and that a woman with a place does not need to be given it by others." Neither the Duke nor Lady Sabine answered her at once. The words hung in the interior of the carriage, plain and portable, and settled the way a small stone settles in still water. Lady Sabine, without looking up, turned the page of her book at last. The Duke, in his corner, turned his face very slightly from the window and looked at Ivy for a long, even second, and did not speak, and looked away again. The carriage came, presently, over the top of a low rise. Below them, at the end of a long avenue of limes, the lights of Ashenvale House were beginning, in the mist, to come on one by one, unhurried, as candles are lit in a room where the household knows exactly how many candles it has. Ashenvale House, when the carriage came down the last of the avenue and drew to a halt beneath the wide stone porch, did not announce itself. It merely stood, low and long and gray against the grayer sky, its rows of windows lit in pairs from within by a soft, unhurried light that suggested a house which had been sitting the whole evening quite calmly at its own hearth and had risen only just now to open its door. The door opened before the coachman had come down from his box. A steward in a plain dark coat stood at the top of the steps, with a lantern in one hand and a folded cloth over his arm, and behind him, in the hall, a housekeeper of about 50 in a black gown was already dropping the smallest curtsy. Neither of them, Ivy noted, so much as glanced at her cloak. Whatever word had come down from Lady Sabine's man ahead of them, it had come with the plain instruction that the young lady in gray was to be received as though she had been expected since morning. Ivy was received as though she had been expected since morning. A bedchamber had been aired, a fire had been laid, hot water had been carried, a supper of soup and bread and a small dish of stewed fruit was brought up upon a tray by a housemaid who curtsied without smirking and left without lingering. A nightgown of clean linen, unmarked, was laid across the bed, and beside it a folded shawl of soft gray wool with a card upon it in Lady Sabine's quick, unornamented hand that read only, in case the fire fails, S. Ivy sat at last. Upon the edge of that bed, in that clean, unornamented room, with the violet brooch still pinned at her collar, and did not for a long moment move, she was not accustomed to being expected. She was not accustomed to the small, deliberate mercies of a good house. She undressed slowly, because she wished to remember the room. She laid the brooch upon the little table by the bed. She folded her mother's gray cloak over the chair, as one folds a companion who has walked a long day. She slept, at last, with her hand upon the shawl of soft gray wool, and did not, all night, dream. The following morning arrived beneath a sky that had washed itself clean, and Ivy, coming down to the breakfast room at the hour a maid had softly named to her, found the household already gathered. The Dowager Duchess of Ashenvale, small and upright and dressed in a shade of dove that was neither mourning nor its opposite, sat at the head of the table with a cup between her hands and, on the linen beside her plate, a small enameled miniature Ivy knew before she had crossed the threshold. Beside the miniature lay an open book with a marbled cover, and Ivy knew that too. Beside the book sat, in a chair drawn close and with a cane hooked over the arm, a woman of perhaps 75 with a bright straight back, a black lace cap, and eyes so exactly like Ivy's mother's that Ivy stopped in the doorway and had to remember, for one clean second, how to breathe. "Grandmother," said Ivy into the small hush, old Lady Whitcomb, who had ridden 10 miles at dawn in her own carriage in weather that would have kept a younger woman in bed, set down her cup with a small, precise clink and said, in a voice like a bell that had been tuned by long use, "Come here, child, and let me look at you." Ivy came. She stopped beside her grandmother's chair. Her grandmother took her hand, held it a moment against her own dry, warm palm, and said, without turning her head, "Louisa Marchcroft is a fool, and she has been a fool since she was 15, and I have written her a letter this morning which I have not sent, out of respect for the paper." Then, looking up at Ivy with the same eyes, she added, "Sit down, my darling. We have work." The Dowager Duchess, who had watched the small exchange without a flicker, said in a voice quieter and drier than her daughter's, and with the same slow amusement, "Miss Marchcroft, your grandmother came at 4 in the morning. She has already had 2 cups of tea. I have accepted, this hour, the responsibility of introducing you to a boiled egg. Please sit." Ivy sat. The boiled egg was introduced, toast was buttered, a cup was poured. And while she ate, in a decent unhurried manner because she had been taught to eat that way, even in emergencies, her grandmother opened the marbled book and turned it to face her, and pointed with a thin finger to a page dated the 3rd of May. "There," said Lady Whitcomb. "Mrs. Ellis's own book, sent to me before dawn by her own hand with her own note, which reads, 'Miss Marchcroft was in this room from 10 in the morning until 4:30 in the afternoon, in the company of Miss Weaver and Miss Petch and myself and Bess the spaniel, and I will swear it before any bench in England. There is the 4th, there is the 5th, there is the 6th. She was under my eye for 6 hours a day, for 3 days. She drew, on the 3rd of May, a bowl of pears and a candlestick, of which the pears were better than the candlestick, though she has done candlesticks since." The Dowager Duchess lifted, with 2 fingers, the enameled miniature, and turned it delicately to catch the morning light. "And this," she said, "is the miniature Sir Peveril has been at some pains to describe. Mrs. Ellis painted it 3 years ago." In the corner, in a hand that is manifestly not Miss Marchcroft's, being a hand 30 years older and taught by a different mistress, one reads, "My Ivy, 7 years old at the fair." The forger, if there is one, will have copied that inscription, believing it to be hers. He will have got her hand wrong, because he will have got her mother's instead. "It is," said the Dowager Duchess, mildly, "an entirely useful mistake." The Duke, at the far end of the table, said, without looking up from the paper by his plate, "One anomaly is enough." Lady Sabine, who had come in a moment before, and had been standing by the sideboard pouring for herself with the quiet efficiency of a woman who did not wake her household to be poured for, added, "And we have 3. The letter, my dears, was produced this morning at 8 in the yard of the King's Head at Ashenvale, under Wynne, by a man in Sir Peveril's pay. It is a bad forgery on cheap paper. It bears a date of the 3rd of May. It attempts a female hand and gets precisely the inscription on the miniature. My brother Steward has it. It will be shown at 11 in the parlor of Mrs. Dorrington, before Mrs. Dorrington's neighbors, at which time your grandmother, Miss Marchcroft, will be present with Mrs. Ellis's book, and your mother's grandmother's writing case in which 50 of her letters lie in her own hand, and I shall be present with this miniature, and my brother will be present with, I believe, a rather brief statement upon the character of Sir Peveril Crane, which he has been composing in his head since yesterday afternoon, and which, I am told, he intends to make only once." Ivy set down her cup. She had not, until this moment, quite believed that a lie could be undone by breakfast. She said, quietly, "Thank you. All of you." The Dowager Duchess inclined her head 1/4 of an inch, which was, in that house, an embrace. Her grandmother put a hand over hers and left it there. The Duke, at the far end of the table, said, without lifting his eyes, "Do not thank us before the door is shut, Miss Marchcroft. Thank us after." And so, at 11, in Mrs. Dorrington's parlor at Ashenvale, under Wynne, before Mrs. Dorrington in her chair, and the rector's wife, and 2 of the school's trustees, and a Mrs. Halberd who was known to carry news like a small industrious river, and a Mr. Halberd who was known to follow her, and before Sir Peveril Crane himself, who had come confident and left otherwise, the letter was produced. It was read. It was compared against the miniature. It was compared against Mrs. Ellis's book. It was compared against the 50 letters in a locked writing case which old Lady Whitcomb, without ceremony, unlocked upon Mrs. Dorrington's table with a small brass key she carried on a chain at her waist. The forger's date was impossible. The forger's hand was Ivy's mother's, not Ivy's. The inscription in the miniature, which the forger had copied with such care, was the exact inscription he ought never to have used. The rector, who had come prepared to be grave, went quite pink. Mrs. Halberd, who had come prepared to be sorrowful, went quite quiet. Sir Peveril, who had come prepared to be delicately concerned, went the color of a boiled ham, and then the color of paper. It was at this point that the Duke spoke, once and briefly, and only once, as Lady Sabine had promised. He said, "Sir Peveril Crane, I have listened to your account. I do not believe it. I do not believe you have believed it. I shall not receive you at Ashenvale House again in my lifetime, and it will be known in this county that I do not. I shall not enter into a suit against you, because Miss Marchcroft's name is not to be dragged again for your convenience through any court. But I shall write, this afternoon, to every man of my acquaintance in this county and the 2 adjoining, and I shall inform them, in language they will understand, that you have attempted, this month, to injure a lady of my household with a forged letter, and that I have watched you do it, and that I hold you responsible. Good morning." He inclined his head to Mrs. Dorrington. He inclined it to old Lady Whitcomb. He did not incline it to Sir Peveril Crane. Sir Peveril left the parlor by the door, and Ashenvale under Wynne by the road within the hour, and did not, in Ivy's lifetime, return to it. Mrs. Halberd, who had a keen professional eye for the direction of a wind, laid her hand upon Ivy's arm as she went out and said, "My dear, I have always said you had your mother's steadiness," and Ivy, who had never in her life heard Mrs. Halberd say any such thing, said with her mother's calm, "Thank you, Mrs. Halberd, that is very kind." The trustees stayed. The rector stayed. Mrs. Dorrington, who had wept once quietly during the reading of the forged letter, and had not wept since, took Ivy's hand in both of hers and said, "My dear, we shall build the shelves next week." It was late in the afternoon before the small storm which had been gathering all morning across the moor to the east of Ashenvale, under Wynne, at last broke over the town. It came down in a great slate-colored slide of rain and wind, and by 5 o'clock the road to Ashenvale House was under 3 inches of running water at the ford, and by 6 the coachman was of the opinion that a return that evening would be foolishness, and by 7 Mrs. Dorrington had insisted that Ivy be given the small yellow bedchamber at the top of her own house until morning. And the Duke, who had ridden into town separately upon a matter of his own after the parlor, had been given the room across the passage. Lady Sabine and old Lady Whitcomb, having stayed for tea and having had, between them, a private conference in the window seat that Ivy could not overhear, but the outline of which she could quite well guess, had returned to Ashenvale House before the ford rose, taking with them all the evidence, and had left, upon the small table in Mrs. Dorrington's parlor, only the enameled miniature and old Lady Whitcomb's grey shawl, folded once, with a card upon it that read, in Lady Whitcomb's spidery hand, "Keep both." The wind, by 10, was leaning against the shutters, as if it too wished to listen. Mrs. Dorrington had gone to bed at 9, with apologies and a candle. The maid had banked the fire in the small parlor that opened off the garden, and had gone to bed at 1:30. The house, at 11, held only 2 waking people, and one of them was Ivy Marchcroft. She had not, could not, go to bed. She had opened the door of the small garden parlor to be sure the fire was safely banked, and had, upon finding it not yet quite low, seated herself upon the settle beside it, with the grey shawl about her shoulders and the miniature upon her lap. The parlor had a single lamp burning low upon the table. Beyond the glass of its narrow door, the garden was a black, wet field of moving leaves. She had been sitting there perhaps a quarter of an hour when the door from the passage opened quietly, and the Duke, in his shirt sleeves and a coat thrown loose over them, and his hair damp at the temples as though he too had been to a window somewhere, came in. He stopped in the doorway. "May I?" he said. Ivy, whose hand had gone at once to the brooch that was not, this evening, at her throat but pinned to the shawl, said yes. He shut the door behind him. He did not shut it entirely. He left it a hand's breadth open, in the punctilious manner of a man who had been reared to close no door entirely upon a woman not of his family, and this small deliberate courtesy Ivy noticed and did not, at first, know what to do with. He crossed the parlor to the hearth. He did not sit. He stood, one hand upon the mantel-shelf, and looked into the low fire. The rain outside beat once, hard, upon the garden door, and passed. "Miss Marchcroft," he said. "Yes," said Ivy. "There is a thing," he said, "which I have been going to say to you since yesterday afternoon in the Rose and Compass, and which I have not said, because I have not, until this evening, known how." Ivy did not answer. She did not lower her eyes. She did not, as she had been trained by a great many people over a great many years to do at moments of this kind, hurry the man opposite her to fill a silence with something safer than the truth. She let the silence stand. He took, in the low fire's light, one step away from the mantel. He said, "I came into that yard yesterday morning intending to change my horses in a quarter of an hour and to be at Ashenvale House by evening. And I saw, standing behind a family who did not deserve her, a young woman in a gray cloak with a violet brooch at her throat, who was being called useful by two women too small to know what the word caused." He took a second step. "I have been called many things in my life," he said, "but I have not, in 11 years, been startled by a face in a coaching yard. Yesterday, I was." He took a third step. "I did not know then why I was startled. I have sat with the matter since." He took a fourth. "I know now." Ivy, without moving her hands from the miniature upon her lap, said, in a voice she had not quite prepared, "Your Grace?" "Adrian," he said quietly. "In this room, if you will." "Adrian," said Ivy. He was, then, at the settle. He did not sit. He knelt once upon one knee at the far end of the settle, at a decent distance from her, so that his face was, for the first time in their acquaintance, level with hers. He said, and she heard at last, the thing his sister had told her only by silences, that the Duke's voice, when it truly meant a thing, was quieter than his ordinary voice, and not louder. "I did not come to this parlor tonight because I have been alone in an empty house. I did not come to this parlor tonight because I have been shaken by a lie told about you by a scoundrel, though I have been. I did not come to this parlor tonight because my sister, who has been arranging futures since she was 6 years old, has arranged one now. I came to this parlor tonight because when there is no room full of people to watch me, and no letter to answer, and no county to reassure, and no horse waiting in a yard, and no sister at my shoulder, I still wish to be in whatever room you are in. And I have known that since a wet morning at Havershill, when I asked you what business you had at Ashenvale under Wynne, and you told me you had a plan." Ivy did not move. She did not, this time, blink hard. She let her eyes fill and did not, at first, try to stop them. He said, more quietly still, "I have wished since yesterday to say to you that I have watched in 2 days more grace under insult than I have seen in a lifetime of drawing rooms, and that I have watched in 2 days more competence in a woman's hand than I have seen in 10 years of stewards, and that I have watched in 2 days a woman whose worth has been called useful by fools who did not know a comfort from a candle, and that I have watched in 2 days a woman I should like, if she will have me, to stand beside for the rest of my life, not before her, not behind her, only beside her. Ivy heard her own breath and heard, beneath it, her mother's voice from a chair by a window 7 years ago. A woman with a place does not need to be given it by others. She let the tears fall once down her cheeks and did not wipe them, because they were not, she understood now, the tears of a woman collapsing. They were the tears of a truth arriving at the surface of the water where a woman had been keeping it patiently for 7 years under her hand. She said quietly, "Adrian." "Yes," he said. "I have been called useful all my life," said Ivy. "I have been called useful by my aunt in the morning, and by my cousins at dinner, and by a maid behind a shutter, and by a man who came out of the rain to warm his back at a stranger's fire. I have decided this year that I shall not be called useful again in any house I choose to sit in. I shall be, in my own house, a woman who plans and reads and teaches and keeps books and mends what is worth mending and mends nothing else. If I am to be in your house, I shall be that woman there also. I shall not be useful to you. I shall be, if you will have me so, only what I am." He inclined his head once without lowering his eyes. "Yes," he said, "that is what I am asking." Then Ivy, who had for the last minute been withholding, without knowing she withheld it, the single simple word that would have ended the matter, held it a moment longer, not because she wished to punish him, not because she did not know her answer, because she had been asked, at last, a question by a person who had waited for her answer, and she wished, for once, to answer it in her own time. She said, "Will you sit?" He sat upon the settle beside her at a decent distance and put his hands ungloved upon his knees. The fire caught a small dry piece and flared briefly and settled. Ivy set the miniature aside upon the small table. She took the shawl from her shoulders and laid it across her lap. She put her hand, palm up, upon the shawl between them and did not quite look at him. He put his hand, without speaking, into hers. His hand was warm. Her hand did not shake. "Yes," she said. Then, because she wished, for reasons of her own, to answer him in the same shape he had asked, she said, "Not because I am alone in an empty house, not because I have been called useful by a scoundrel, not because a woman in a plum traveling dress arranged, in a carriage yesterday, a future I did not know she was arranging. Yes, because I wish it." He closed his hand upon hers and did not let it go. He did not speak. He did not, in the way of men who have been schooled since boyhood to keep their eyes level, look away. And Ivy, whose free hand had gone to the pinned brooch upon the shawl, felt the small silver oval under her fingers, as one feels a small silver bell at the end of a long journey, and heard, inside her head, in her mother's voice, the sentence she had carried for 7 years, plain and portable, and now, at last, understood. A woman with a voice does not need a loud one. A woman with a place does not need to be given it by others. She had a voice. She had, at last, a place. She had not been given it. She had walked into it, in a gray cloak, in the wrong carriage, on a wet morning at Haverhill, and had, with a valise upon her knees and a parcel of sandwiches under her arm and a violet brooch at her throat, sat down. They sat then, a long while, upon the settle in the small garden parlor of Mrs. Dorrington's house at Ashenvale, under Wynne, with their joined hands upon a gray shawl and the low fire warming them and the rain, at last thinning outside, and did not speak, because a great many things had at last been said. When the clock in the passage struck 2, Ivy said, quietly, "My grandmother will have opinions." "Many," said Adrian. "Old Lady Whitcomb," said Ivy, "will require me to be married from Whitcomb Grange, in the small chapel at the east of the park, in the month of April, in my mother's veil, which I have never seen, but of which I have heard since I was 6. "Old Lady Whitcomb," said Adrian, "shall have exactly that." "My mother," said Ivy, "will not be invited." "Your Aunt Louisa," said Adrian, "may be invited to sit at the back of the chapel if she requires it. She may not be seated in the second pew. She will not be seated at all in mine." Ivy said, "And the library." "The library," said Adrian, "will open at Michaelmas. There will be shelves at a child's height, and at a woman's height, and at a man's height, and the reading room will be turned as you have planned it, and I shall pay for the paint of the door, because it pleases me." Ivy said, "And Delphine?" "And Cassandra?" Adrian said, "They will do as they do." He said it kindly. He said it without contempt. He said it as a man who had understood, in 3 sentences, that a cousin who has spent 7 years painting her sister as useful does not, in the end, deserve either revenge or continued attention. Ivy, who had wondered, in the corners of her chest, whether he would demand of her some public humiliation of her cousins in exchange for what he had offered, discovered, in the plainness of his sentence, that he would not, and that this too was a kind of restraint she had not expected. She released, without noise, a breath she had been holding for 7 years. The rain thinned over the garden into a small last patter and then into nothing at all. The sky, before Ivy had noticed it was doing so, had begun very slowly to pale in the direction of the east, over the black wet leaves. The small yellow bedchamber upstairs waited for her. The room across the passage waited for him. She rose. He rose. He did not let go her hand. In the passage, at the foot of the small crooked stair, he did not, at last, let go her hand either, though he had to, in a moment, to allow her to climb. He held it a small measurable second, and put it at the last instant to his mouth once, briefly and without ceremony, and released it. Then he stood at the foot of the stair, and did not follow, and watched her go up. Ivy, upon the small landing, turned, and looked down at him, and said, quietly, "Good night, Adrian. Good night, Ivy," he said. It was the first time he had said her name. It sat in the small stairwell like a lamp that had been lit. April at Whitcomb Grange came in with lambs upon the low hills and blackthorn foaming white along the lanes, and the small chapel at the east of the park, whitewashed and cool and smelling faintly of the beeswax with which old Lady Whitcomb's housekeeper had polished every pew for a week, held on the morning of the 14th exactly the persons old Lady Whitcomb had chosen for it to hold, and only those. Mrs. Dorrington was there in the second pew, having consented, upon written argument from the Dowager Duchess, to be carried the 10 miles in a closed carriage. The rector of Ashenvale, under Wynne, was there. The 3 trustees of the girls' school were there. The Dowager Duchess of Ashenvale sat in the first pew on the groom's side, in a gown of the same dove as her breakfast, and beside her Lady Sabine, in a traveling dress the exact shade of a bluebell, and beside Lady Sabine an older cousin with a kind face and a small great many chins. On the bride's side, in the first pew, sat old Lady Whitcomb alone, upright as a candle. In the second pew on the bride's side, at old Lady Whitcomb's grave and deliberate invitation, sat Mrs. Ellis of Haversham, with Bess the spaniel at her feet, and, at Mrs. Ellis's elbow, a Miss Weaver and a Miss Petch, both of whom had grown, in 3 years into young women who could sit still through a wedding. Aunt Marchcroft was not invited. Uncle Marchcroft was not invited. Delphine had, in the intervening months, made a match with a country gentleman who had not the fortune of a duke, and had, upon meeting Delphine, discovered that a fortune had never been the point, and was happy. Cassandra had been sent to a cousin at Bath for the sake of her nerves, and had, there, taken up the piano. Sir Peveril Crane had been asked to leave 2 of the clubs he had considered his own, and had removed with his pale wife to a small house in a small town at the northern border of the county, from which he had not, in 6 months, ventured. Ivy walked up the aisle of the small chapel upon her grandmother's arm, in a gown of plain ivory silk with no ornament whatever, and a veil of old lace which had been her mother's, and which she had, in the last hour, seen for the first time in her life, and pinned at the throat of the gown, in the exact place it had lived upon her gray cloak, the small silver oval brooch with the pressed violet behind glass. Adrian, standing at the altar in a plain dark coat with no ornament at all, watched her come, and did not, in the manner of a great many men at such moments, smile too widely or too soon. He waited. When she had come, he took her hand. She gave it. They were married. It was a very quiet wedding. It was, all in all, exactly the wedding old Lady Whitcomb had waited 7 years to give. Michaelmas, in that same year, was a day of low gold sunshine at Ashenvale under Wynne, and the small stone building at the corner of the market square, which had once been an unused chapter house belonging to the parish, and which had, in the intervening summer, been swept and mended and painted and shelved and lit and named, the Whitcomb Marchcroft Library was opened, at 3 in the afternoon, by the Duchess of Ashenvale in person. She wore a gown of deep green, which was, she had decided, a color she liked in autumn, and at her throat, in its old place, the small silver brooch. The reading room, turned as she had planned it, took the shallow south light exactly as she had said it would. The shelves at the child's height held storybooks, and the shelves at the woman's height held novels and household books, and books of drawing and of poetry, and the shelves at the man's height held histories and books of law and of husbandry, and along one wall, exactly as she had noted in the sketch she had folded into an account book upon a wet morning in a coaching yard, ran a long, low bench that was cheaper than chairs and held more children. The children of Ashenvale under Wynne on that afternoon filled the bench. Their mothers stood behind them. Mrs. Dorrington, who had been carried down in her chair, sat by the reading room window and did not speak, and did not need to. Mrs. Halberd, who had come, wept twice and told everyone in earshot that she had always said Miss Marchcroft, that was, had the steadiest hand in the county, and Mr. Halberd at her elbow agreed. Old Lady Whitcomb stood beside the door with her cane and watched her granddaughter with the small dry pride of a woman who had been right about a great many things for a great many years and was, at last, being allowed to enjoy the fact. Lady Sabine, in a traveling dress the exact shade of a bluebell she had not yet outgrown, stood at Ivy's shoulder and did not, that afternoon, arrange anything. When the small crowd had settled and the children had, with some effort, been persuaded not to touch the books until spoken to, Adrian, Duke of Ashenvale, stepped forward once upon the small strip of red carpet the trustees had laid at the door, and lifted a hand for silence, and the crowd, without needing to be asked twice, gave it. He said, in the voice that had never needed to be loud, "I have been asked, this afternoon, to say a few words at the opening of this library. I shall say fewer than a few." He paused. There was a small ripple of the polite laughter with which country crowds acknowledge a great man's modesty. He waited it out. He went on, "When my wife came into this county a year ago," he said, "she came in a gray cloak with a valise and a parcel of sandwiches and a plan for a library folded between the pages of an account book. She was received in this county, by some of you and by many others, with a word. The word was useful. It was meant, by those who used it, to shrink her." He paused again. "It was," he said, "the wrong word." The crowd had gone entirely still. He said, "They were wrong." And then, because he was, when he chose, a man who used the small, deliberate rhetorical shapes he had been given by a great many tutors, in a great many rooms, he said, they were wrong when they said she was useful, and meant by it that she was small. They were wrong when they said she was quiet, and meant by it that she was without a voice. They were wrong when they said she was without fortune, and meant by it that she was without worth. He looked, for the first time in the speech, at Ivy, who was standing beside Old Lady Whitcomb by the door. He said, "My wife is a woman who plans a room for the child who cannot yet reach the top shelf. My wife is a woman who mends what is worth mending and mends nothing else. My wife is a woman whose hand, at 23, was steadier than any hand in the county I could name. This building stands because she drew it. This library exists because she imagined it. The children of this town will read here because she thought of them before she thought of herself." He paused a last time. He said, more quietly, "She was always worth believing in. May every child who takes a book from this room today know that a plan drawn in a small hand upon a folded paper in a coaching yard by a woman whom no one at the time thought worth the ink may become, in a year, a house full of light." He inclined his head. He stepped back. There was a silence, perhaps 2 heartbeats long. Then the applause began. It was not the polite scatter of a country crowd doing its duty. It was the deep, steady clap of a room that had, without meaning to, been convinced. Mrs. Halberd, in the middle of it, wept a 3rd time and did not apologize. Old Lady Whitcomb, beside Ivy, did not clap, because Old Lady Whitcomb did not clap for any speech, but she turned her head and looked at her granddaughter and inclined her chin 1/4 of an inch, which was, in that grandmother, an ovation. The children on the bench, having been given permission at last by a small nod from Mrs. Dorrington, rose in a soft rush and went, without pushing, to the shelves. Ivy watched them go. A small girl in a mended pinafore reached, upon the low shelf, for a book with a red spine, and looked at the picture on its cover, and sat down upon the bench with it open across her lap. Ivy, watching, felt her mother's aphorism go through her a last time, and, this time, felt it settle. A woman with a voice does not need a loud one. A woman with a place does not need to be given it by others. The child on the bench, who did not yet know she had either, would learn, in this room, that she had both. That evening, when the small crowd had thinned and the trustees had gone home, and Mrs. Dorrington had been carried back to her house, and Old Lady Whitcomb had been persuaded, at last, to accept a chair by the fire in the Duchess's private sitting room at Ashenvale House, and a cup of something hot in her hand, and Lady Sabine had, with the air of a woman who had earned it, gone up to her own room for an hour with a book, Ivy and Adrian went out, alone, into the small walled garden at the back of the house, in the last of the light. The storm which had begun the day at the edge of the moor had, all afternoon, been threatening, and had held off for the opening, and had, in the hour before sunset, at last broken. Rain had come down hard for 20 minutes, and had gone as quickly as it had come. And now, along the low western horizon beyond the wall, the sky was clearing to a pale gold under a strip of clean cloud, and the wet gravel of the garden path shone with the last of the light. Ivy walked with her hand in Adrian's hand upon the wet gravel. She was, that evening, in the same green gown she had worn to the opening, with the small silver brooch still at her throat and at her shoulders. Old Lady Whitcomb's gray shawl. He walked beside her, not before her, not behind her, only beside her. They did not, for some minutes, speak. At the end of the path, a small wooden gate stood in the garden wall, giving upon a low, sloping meadow that ran down toward the eastern fields, and beyond the meadow, over the far hedge. The first pale rose of dawn upon the world after the storm was beginning to lift into the sky. Ivy stopped at the gate. She looked at the light on the wet grass and did not, this time, weep, she said. Quietly, this is not what I imagined, upon a wet morning in Haversham, that a year would look like. Adrian, whose hand had not left hers, said, "No, nor I." She said, "It is not perfect." He said, "No," she said, "it has not been easy." He said, "No," she said, "it is only in the end shared." He said, "Yes." "And that," said Ivy, quietly, as the first true light of the new morning reached, over the far hedge, the gate at which they stood, is more than enough. Adrian, without speaking, drew her hand up between them and closed his other hand over it, so that her hand lay held between his two, as one holds a small silver thing one has been carrying a long way and does not, now, intend to set down. They stood so a moment. Then he opened the gate. They went through, hand in hand, into the wet gold meadow, toward the pale rose light climbing at last over the eastern fields, and did not, on the way, let go.